Cool.
No, Mark joins.
Hi, Mark. Hi, Mark.
Hello.
Hi.
Very excited to be on here.
Same
Hi,
here.
Mark.
I don't have all day, but I have some time, so I'm really glad to get to be a part of this.
Excellent. I was just saying to Daniel, we've been very excited about your work from the residency.
Yeah. I could not be more excited for that, honestly.
Yes. I was saying I saw your work and was just like, oh my God, this guy has to have it. And then everyone was so excited about it. It was really, really great.
That's so cool. Thank you. I appreciate that a lot.
When are you starting?
I am starting the 29th, so 3.5, 4 days.
Nice.
Yep. Yeah, I've got everything packed. I'm moving studios, so I'm ready.
Excellent. Cool. Well, we're just waiting for Nicole to connect back on. She was having some
wonderful
issues with sound.
And don't worry, Mark, I left a mess in the studio for you.
Amazing. You know exactly how I work, Daniel. I'm comfortable in a mess.
Hi, Nicole. Can you? Oh, it's still connecting, actually. Can you hear us now, Nicole?
Yes, I'm on, and I can speak too. Hello.
Hi, Nicole.
Hi.
So nice to have all three of you on. So I'll do a short intro and then we'll go to questions. And I think people will be able to add questions in the chat as well. So if there's anything at the end that you would like to ask, I will keep an eye on anything that's coming through. So I'm Emily Steer, and I'm really excited to be talking with Nicole Basilone, Daniel Morowitz, and Mark Zubrovich as well, who we weren't expecting to be on. So that's very exciting. All three artists are showing at Left Out Art in Dogmatic Magic Part 2, a show curated by Manufacturers Village artists. And I'm Emily Steer, editor of Elephant Magazine, a magazine, digital store and art school making creativity accessible for everyone. So you can check out our current artist-led classes at elephantacademy.art, shop for original artist prints and art supplies at elephantkiosk.art, and head to elephant.art for daily editorial content, and our very exciting latest print magazine, which features Marina Abramovich on the main cover and Sin White Kin and Tai Shani on the special release cover. So today we have Nicole Basilone, whose dynamic paintings are mostly landscape-based and pulled from ecosystems which are being damaged due to the effects of global warming. Her work often references art history in some context, such as the marks, colour and composition. We also have Daniel Morowitz, who explores the idea of queerness as monstrous in his work. He often paints bodies and wild animals amidst a tangle of natural forms, and he's inspired by Christian iconography, artists such as William Blake, and apocalyptic imagery. And also Mark Zubrovich, who we're very excited to have here, who is also in the show. He's created his own world in his paintings with a humorous queer space inhabited by anthropomorphic dogs. Manufacturers Village houses the Liquitex artist residency, which Mark is about to join. So thank you so much, all three of you, for being on today. It would be great to start with the influence of art history. I know Daniel and Nicole, especially, you've mentioned how important the role of art history is to your work, and that you do quite a lot to kind of forge your own space within the canon. I wondered for all three of you what your biggest inspirations have been and how you subvert or reimagine them in your paintings. Nicole, would you like to go first?
Sure. My work mostly has been focused on reimagining the context of the female gaze with male generated work from the 18th century by like Camille Pissarro, Renoir, Gauguin, and I'm using, initially I'm eliminating the female figure completely. In some recent work, I've been using myself and repurposing myself in the work, or I've been just repainting the paintings exactly as they are, especially like several from Camille Pissarro's work, and kind of imagining it in the context of a modern woman looking back at this 18th century person and how that person would feel being painted now. So I'm kind of always curious about what that meant to not only the person posing for the male, but how I can kind of reinterpret that as a female painter in the contemporary world with my love of landscape.
And how about you, Daniel?
I I'm really interested in queering the art historical canon. I think there's a narrative to art history, that is very, whitewashed, very from a cis straight perspective. And I'll use mythological imagery, or particularly like Western canon, like Judeo-Christian or Greco-Roman, um, as very much like a access point. So Renaissance painters obviously reference those stories and those mythologies as a means to talk about contemporary issues. And the symbolists did the same thing back in the early 19th century. So it's a way to kind of build on those histories and use that as a means to interject a contemporary queer perspective. So I'll combine mythological imagery, usually like chimeric imagery, like human animal hybridity, with figures taken either from like myself or friends or lovers or pornography. And I use a lot of collage in the work. So I'll cut up paintings and combine them. And I view the conceptual side of it as its own form of collage, where I'm sloppily taking these mythological elements and combining them with with the contemporary elements as a means to kind of like cut and paste them into an art historical context.
Brilliant. And how about you, Mark?
I think that those are both really good answers. And I think I'm doing a little bit of both of the things that you're talking about, that sort of revelation by obfuscation that Nicole is mentioning, like picking and taking things in and out of old work and making something new out of it. And also what Daniel is saying about like chopping up art history and seeing it as fertile ground for planting something new or pulling something new out of the surface. I think I'm interested in both of those things. How I kind of take from the entire canon of art history. I'm interested in looking at everything from ancient work that we tend to look at like more anthropologically, which I think hopefully the art world is slowly starting to correct on. And I'm also interested in looking at sort of these, I've been really interested in these old masterworks, like these Dutch sort of allegorical paintings that use, I mean, all of art history uses the dog in particular as symbol or background character, or an allegory for something like fertility or masculinity or virility or loyalty. Like the dog has so many meanings all across art history. And I'm so fascinated with how our relationship with something like outside of ourselves, we interpret it in so many ways. It's kind of like how Nicole is talking about how men look at women in a certain way in art history. I'm interested in sort of flipping that on its head and how we relate to something like totally non-human, something that we relate with and we talk to and have this relationship with on so many levels, but we can never fully understand them. So I'm interested in kind of flipping that and putting my perspective on how like humans interpret dog behaviors, how dogs might interpret human behaviors, and like all of these mixtures that end up sort of incidentally, but me purposefully putting it in this very queer space.
Yeah. We've obviously all grown up with this very limited sort of narrative on art history and, who gets to be in those works. And in the last couple of years, there's been so much conversation that's really broadened that out. But do any of you feel on a personal level, there was like a moment or an artwork or an artist that really made you start thinking, hang on, where am I in this? Or is it something that's kind of happened gradually as cultures evolved as well, and we've really begun talking about things like that?
That's a really good question. I think one thing really specifically I can pick out in like my history as an artist and somebody that's been consuming work was that there was this show, these two shows that were happening around like 2009, 2010 at the Whitney Museum that featured work by these queer artists from the 80s and 90s, like like some very serious work by Keith Haring, work by General Idea and A.A. Bronson, and also I think especially for me, David Morowitz. These were artists for me that were really formative in my early years, like just having the first foot out of the closet and all of that, that were making work that were radical in their politics, but also radical in the way that they like showed love for their own histories, even if it had to go through something traumatic. I think that those movements in those modern movements, I think were really, really influential on me growing up.
I think for me, I was given a piece of advice in grad school that's kind of stuck to me to this day. We're always painting against art history. So every painting you're making is, it has the weight of all of, the historical canon behind it. And I found it very crushing at the time, but then a reevaluation of that statement was like, oh, we have this entire history to pull from that, it's like in box of crayons that you can choose any color that you want and put them in any combination. So it was a great way for me to think about breaking up a narrative that's presented so linearly, and when it really isn't such a linear path. And as far as artists go, I saw this great David Hockney retrospective at the Met a few years ago. And that always stuck with me because he had a whole series of paintings that he did out in the Midwest that was like between his time in grad school and before the LA paintings that everyone thinks about of the pool and stuff. And they were so almost digital and contemporary and different, but still very much him, in a way that like, oh, I'd never been exposed to this. And I feel like there was such a narrative about him that even, that even everyone's narrative can be changed to kind of fit in an art historical canon and context. And it was just a different way to think about someone's work in that way. And also, David Hockney is queer. He uses acrylic paint, which, is, to me, who is also an acrylic painter, it's, somebody that I consider part of like the canon that I live in. So it was a very almost transformative show.
And sorry, Nicole.
For me, I remember I had a lot of critiques in undergrad about my work being too much like de Kooning's. I was definitely kind of obsessed with like the abstract art movement during my junior and senior year of undergrad. But one thing I recognized very quickly was, reading art history books, the focus is always male painter based, even in a relationship between Lee Krasner and her husband Jackson Pollock, the focus was very much based on his career. I definitely prefer her work more. And I just kind of remember like thinking about all the voids in history where women are kind of eliminated. And then how I was focusing on a period in time that was extremely male dominated, but I was drawn to his work because it was strong and it was interesting and I liked the viscosity of the paint. But I also had to ask myself these questions of like, how do I separate myself from that, but also do it in a more contemporary way? Because I think a lot of times in undergrad, grad school, et cetera, you get critiqued on your work and they'll be like, oh, your work is referencing this person, referencing that person. And you have to learn to kind of take those critiques and either roll with them or, embrace the resemblance. For me, I kind of always try to, sit on that information and then like work it into my work, but my work is still very strongly in the abstract realm, primarily, especially with landscape. So one of my biggest influences of a female painter would be Cecily Brown, because she's also working with like the figure, but it's very concealed. And I think conceptually, she's just someone that I look up to and just really love and appreciate her work.
Yeah, she's really brilliant. So you all include kind of nature and animals to different degrees, sometimes completely wild and sometimes they're sort of part of the human world. What do they represent for you in your work, and what do you want to convey to viewers of your work about kind of the natural world and how it fits around or within, or how we fit within it?
Yeah, I would say for me, there's always a hybridity with the animal inclusion. Usually it's, you know, chimeric human animal hybrid forms, and it's always about in-betweenness and queerness. Like it's not quite human, not quite animal. It's that queerness as interruption. And you know, it's a form that, you know, to like, how do you know, I'm really interested in queerness as movement. Like, you know, that there's that I always think of that quote, to define me is to negate me. So how do you paint something which is so static as indefinable? So, you know, it's talking about identity as being in between, as being neither here nor there, as being insider outsider. You know, so that's where all that always fits into the work. And then obviously, like, through the art historical context of, like, you know, the chimera in mythology, or like sphinxes, or any of these hybrid imagery.
I think that kind of the way that you're talking about it, it makes me think of one of like the foundational texts for me as an artist is Jack Halberstam's Queer Art of Failure. And the way that you're talking about chimeric, and I love the word that you used before, humanimal. I love that so much. It makes me think of how Jack talks in that book about how there's like an inherent failure to queerness in some way, and it forces you to form new pathways. And I think that's how I kind of approach nature or the animal in my work, where it's this relationship between the human and like the other, which is something outside of us, because I think humans tend to see, we tend to see ourselves as outside of nature. And that's why we tend to destroy nature so much, is because we see it as outside of ourselves. And I'm sort of interested in that, and another sort of like holistic way of bringing the human form onto an animal and bringing the animal form onto a human as a way to sort of better understand and to maybe sort of decouple that otherization a little bit. I think that's one of the reasons I'm so attracted to anthropomorphism, is that idea of putting the human onto something non-human as a way to sort of understand both of them. Again, that sort of revelation by obfuscation.
Yeah.
My landscape practice began in undergraduate school. I took a landscape painting class at MICA. It was a pretty involved course where it was like 6 hours of painting plein air and then 3 hours of a lecture afterwards. And it was my first time experiencing plein air painting, and I kind of fell in love with it instantly. And it's been a practice ever since then. For me, there's like two different worlds of, and really reasons why I paint abstract landscapes. The number one reason is I grew up going to the beach and hiking. So I just have a love and a respect for nature, and I enjoy like spending a lot of time outside. And I think I read this book about like Japanese like forest bathing, of the concept of basically you go out into nature and it heals you. It has this like restorative properties, and that was something that was really interesting to me, especially like thinking about a painter like Thomas Cole and how those paintings are kind of like almost worshiping nature, like worshiping the American landscape. And another reason is because I think for me, when I look at art history, there was not like ever a lot of high respect given to people who made landscape paintings. It was kind of like as a crafty, more outsider art realm world. Things have changed now in the modern landscape, but personally, I'm kind of interested in how that transition has happened, and painters like Sarah Hughes and Matthew Wong have kind of elevated landscape painting to what it is now, and how it's kind of like taken off and grown into like this other category of work that people, you know, buy and collect, and it is in the market, and it's more relevant now.
Yeah, it's been really interesting over the last couple of years seeing how that's exploded as well. It felt like there was a time when every art fair it was just like a lot of figurative work and nothing else, and it's like it's kind of moving back again now, which is exciting to see. And Daniel and Mark, you both play with feelings of discomfort quite a lot in your work. So Daniel, you've described your figures as being monstrous or having that kind of monstrous element in the work. And Mark, I just think anytime there's like animals and sexuality together, sometimes people get that kind of like, oh, I don't know where to go with this. What, you know, how do you both feel about the role of discomfort in your work, and sort of how do you want to like play with the viewer with that?
Yeah, that's actually a really great question. And it makes me think of something that happened to me very recently, where I had an old professor tell me a story about how they mentioned my work in their class, and they had a student have a very viscerally negative reaction to it. Like they disrupted the entire class and talked about how my work was like disgusting and promoted deviancy. And that, yeah, I mean, that discomfort is really palpable. It makes me think of just recently, over the course of the last couple of months, there have been a lot of like there's like this whole phenomenon with like school board meetings that are going insane in America right now. And one of the things that's happening in school boards right now is that there was an incident in Michigan a couple months ago where there was this rumor floating around that there was a litter box in a bathroom for students that identified as cats. And it was, yeah, it was this insane rumor that was completely unsubstantiated and not true. But there was this like reactionary media response to it, where it was like in the New York Post, all of these headlines. And I think that discomfort is so, I think, integral to the work that I'm making, because that there's something that makes people uncomfortable about like the animal and thinking about it in terms of like the body and sexuality. And I think there's also something that makes people really uncomfortable about like confronting those things and having them be in a way, having them be presented in a way that is kind of I guess silly and not like super self-serious. And that's part of the discomfort too, having something be presented as like humorous or kind of yeah, fun, or not taking itself too heavily. That is part of the huge discomfort that I think is integral to my work.
Yeah.
I think with my work, it goes back to that narrative thing. I think when it's come to like queer art, it's very much been the prevailing narrative has been the Tom of Finland, Robert Mapplethorpe, very explicit sexual, a very particular representation of gay male body. And even now, where we're having a moment for gay male painters, it seems like they're kind of offshoots of that same narrative. So for me, it's like, while that's important and it's great to celebrate that, it's still not the only narrative around the work, or around queer identity in work. And I guess I wanted to emphasize kind of the less glamorous moments, like the the discomfort of identity, or there's a whole tradition of hiding queer elements in painting, in art history. Like, for example, Saint Sebastian in the Renaissance was a way for painters to paint like the standing male nude sort of thing. So it's drawing from those traditions of being able to hide the queer elements in plain sight and emphasize elements of identity that's a little less celebratory and a little more uncomfortable. And how do you give that almost an aestheticized form to it that's not just two muscle men having sex.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And I think, sorry, carry on.
oh yeah, well, I was just gonna say that's a really good way to put it. And it makes me think how there's something, I guess, fun and kind of sneaky about putting like queer elements in your work, and that like having those avenues, I think, helps prevent the work being read as kind of what I was saying before. It helps safeguard the work against having that reading of being read anthropologically, where it's like, this is actually like coming from the source, like this is coming from the queer mouth, like.
Yeah.
Right.
I think it's really interesting you saying, that there's almost this kind of one form that then ends up taking shape, where it's just like, okay, all queer art has to be Tom of Finland. And I think it is an issue with any kind of art where it's like, great, we've kind of opened this up, we're having this diversity of voices, but then I think there's an expectation of what each of those voices are going to bring, and that then becomes the marketable thing. So it's like, we're representing this voice, but we're representing it as one thing, instead of accepting there's like manifold ways of queer voices within art. And so you do just end up with these kind of trends, I guess, happening, that actually then sometimes can reduce down those viewpoints as well.
Yeah, I think it's and it's not just in queer art. I think it's any art that talks about identity politics. Yeah. It's there's there's usually like one string of narrative that's kind of elevated to mainstream consciousness, which is great. It's great to give visibility to anyone talking about identity or any marginalized identities in the in the work, and give them the voice and that representation. But it does become at a certain point like, oh, let's say, like from my perspective, oh, gay male artists, let's elevate only ones talking about this one. So it's like, it's that double-edged sword, where it's like, it's great to have the mainstream exposure, but when that mainstream exposure is just one single narrative, it kind of falls flat.
Or like showing just one queer body. And that makes me think of that big piece that Nicole has in the show, the big giant one, where it's like, it's the sort of landscape bordering on abstraction, but like, Nicole, you're like literally hiding behind it. It makes me think of like how discomfort enters your work as well, how you are taking like this perspective as a woman, and in a way you're kind of pushing against that idea that like women can only talk about work in one way or like be one kind of artist, but you have to do it by like obscuring yourself. It's kind of like what all three of us are doing. Like, it's like the revelation by obfuscation. Like, I'm going to show you something by hiding something away, or presenting you something in like an alternative form.
Also, I was just thinking about, when women are nude, just in general, like, do we want to, like, how do we expose ourselves? How would I expose myself? I haven't made figurative work in over a decade, since I was in undergrad. And after just kind of getting back into it again, and I was painting, Camille Pizarro's figures, and at first they were clothed, the women were clothed and they were dressed. And then I was like, the next woman I was working on was nude, and I'm like, okay, like, how do I make this a little bit more myself? So I did it like a self-portrait, and as I'm layering the work, I keep covering her up, covering up myself, the figure. And I was like, it was almost like this kind of battle between, my level of comfort with how much I want myself to be exposed, but also like, instead of like her being the one that's being objectified, maybe she's objectifying the person that she's looking at. So I was also thinking about that, just so that that figure isn't representing the female gaze. Like, she could be the person that's gazing, flipping the roles kind of in that way. That's kind of what I was thinking about.
And Nicole, you also have an environmental aspect to your work, even though it's not completely in your face. So obviously you show ecosystems that have been damaged by global warming. How important is it to you that the viewer, gets that side of it or knows that side of it, do you feel like it can just kind of be conveyed and be there in the space, or do you really want it to kind of shout about it?
I definitely don't think it's necessarily something that's obvious to the viewer in a lot of the paintings. There have been times where I've made like forest fire paintings or very literal interpretations of global warming, but I've kind of grown away from that in the past several years. I think as an artist, it's important to represent your political, economic, social beliefs, because we kind of are always like the scapegoat and the first people to expose like problems in the globe. And I've always been, definitely someone who cares about the environment, someone who cares about animals and human rights. So it's like if I'm so focused on this landscape, but then I'm seeing the landscape that I live in change, and like growing up in the North America and having, summer really end in like October now versus when I was first born, and October is really a pure fall. Seeing that change so drastically in my lifetime, I just kind of feel like I'm always in it and thinking about it and engaged with it, because we're having extreme temperature changes of 30 degrees in a day in New York City. It'll be snowing and then it's raining, and it's just kind of this extreme weather. So to me, I guess because we're just living in it, I feel like it's so obvious, and I don't want my work to be super morbid or sad, because I also want people to like be reminded of the beauty. I always like to play with a dichotomy of beauty versus ugliness, and that's sometimes why my palette can be like really off the rails. Like I'll have like the ugliest brown next to like a hot millennial pink or something like that. I definitely like to play with it in a less obvious way, like kind of more subjective, where someone's walking into the work and they might recognize that, but maybe it's not super obvious. But it's definitely something I want people to kind of question when they look at the work.
Yeah. And Mark, you obviously touched on the fact that there is some big backward steps happening in America in some areas at the moment. And obviously since Trump, the landscape has changed quite a lot. As artists working in America, do you feel like you feel that weight of responsibility to be kind of pushing against that? Or is it something that you'd be kind of doing anyway? Do you feel like you have to react to it in any way?
I mean, it's kind of what like Nicole was saying about the weather. It's like, it just kind of feels like you're just in a storm. So, I mean, that's been really, I wouldn't say jarring, because I think it's always kind of been there. It's always been like an undercurrent that's happening in America. But I would say like living in America right now, it definitely feels like we're caught in this fraught situation where it's almost like there are two countries that you're living in. It's one where you feel like super privileged to have, rights as a queer person in some ways or another. But because like we're all in the metro New York area. So there are fewer like actual laws that affect us as queer people than there are in other places in America. So it's like, it's a difficult situation to be in as an artist, because like, it's something that you have to constantly be responding to. And in some way or another in your work, it's gonna flow out in some way, where it's like there was that one bill that just got shot down in Utah that was going to be barring trans people from participating in high school sports. And there are 4 trans athletes in Utah. So it's like the fact that there's like this targeted hatred that is so potent and really has been like rising up so much. I think it really kind of hammers home the point that pretty like all art is political, and especially all queer art is political, because just an act of making something that is openly visibly queer is a political act, and people will try to legislate you out of existence.
Even just to piggyback off of everything Mark said, it's as they say, the personal is the political. So any art that's going to come from a personal perspective always is going to have a political edge to it, whether or not it's overtly about those topics. And even something as benign as like Instagram, where you can post your artwork on, it's been a hotbed for targeting queer artists and getting their work censored and taken down and accounts deleted. It's one of those things where, it's supposed to be a little more plural and egalitarian, but it's not the same for all artists across the spectrum. So, there's that danger of censorship. And I think, at least for my work, I sometimes hide the queer elements as a way to skate by those censorships and just try to like fly a little under the radar. Like, it's not overtly maybe noticeable, but to a very specific audience, they'll pick up on the themes right away.
Yeah. I mean, we've noticed on Elephant, it's got more and more intense with just the automated censorship on those platforms as well. And we write a lot about motherhood, and you'll often have like an image of a woman breastfeeding that's then censored because it's sexual content. It's really like mind-boggling sometimes when you see what gets taken down, and it's often actually the intensely erotic stuff. So there's a Japanese artist called Toshio Seiki who makes like really crazy erotic fantasies that are almost so wild that the algorithm just doesn't pick them up as sexual because it kind of doesn't understand them, because it might be like an octopus and a woman, or just like sort of really crazy proportions and things. So that's been quite interesting, where it might be like a tasteful bum gets taken down, but then you can have something that is almost quite shocking and maybe a bit more coded though that gets through.
Yeah, that's true. And it's, again, kind of one of the great vehicles that Daniel and I have in our work when it comes to like, again, like the humanimal, the anthropomorph, where it's, that's a funny way to think about it, where I've never really thought about like having like the cartoon body or like the anthropomorphic body almost be this way to kind of skirt through that, where it's like you kind of have to try really hard to get censored by Instagram if you're making like, like this vaguely furry art.
It's funny because like, at least with you and I, Mark, we could like clearly make like an animal with a giant tail that's really just a giant penis and probably would just fly by, skate under the radar. Whereas, you have some, I know people that have had much less explicit work get taken down, and it's that wild, it's that wild dichotomy.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, it's that coding that helps you like skate by and escape the erasure that is really, really being pushed forward, like the erasure of queer history. How like you can still buy straight pornography on eBay, but you can't buy gay porn.
Yeah.
And like, wow. Like there are like entire treasure troves of like vintage 70s gay like magazines that can no longer be sold on the internet, essentially. So it's like that like, again, it's like that queer people are constantly in need of forming new languages to skirt around people trying to stamp us out. And that's one of the reasons I keep finding new fruit to pick from this tree of like the anthropomorphic, is that it's like a constant reinvention. Like you can reinvent every single part of the self, and you kind of need to keep doing that as a queer person to survive. It's an adaptation thing.
And it would be great to talk a little bit about your process as well. All of you have incredibly distinctive textures in your work, in the way you paint. It would be great to hear a bit from each of you just about kind of how you work with paint, which kind of paints you really like working with.
I started with oil painting traditionally. That was like my first love of paints, and I still use them, but I actually use watercolor, acrylic, and oil paint now. So I kind of swing around between both. If I have a super tight deadline, I definitely push for using acrylic on the whole layer. If I know I have a bit longer, I'll like do an oil ground and do full, just all oil paints, but I definitely have a lot of different practices in the studios. I am obsessed with the golden mediums and the iridescent medium by Liquitex. And I like to play a lot with like opacity in my work. So I'll thin work down with water if it's acrylic, or I'll thin it down with solvent if it's oil. And I like let like the drips exist and the transparencies, and then I'll build it up with like some chunkier layering, like either a wax medium potentially, or the pumice stone by Golden, or they also have one that's like this glass medium gel that, and kind of get that impasto effect. And then with oil paints, I'll use either wax medium to build it up or a Galkid medium to kind of give it that body that I like. And with the watercolor works, I'm painting a lot on Yupo, which allows me to completely like erase things. So I found that like I don't necessarily have to build things up. If I feel like I've overdone the work or it's too saturated, I can like literally wipe things away. So that's kind of a new medium I introduced the last year or so in my practice that I've been really obsessed with, and I'm trying to find a way to scale it up. That self-portrait in the show is on Yupo. It's acrylic on Yupo, but Yupo is a little bit thin to sustain like the thickness of the acrylic paint. So I'm trying to find a way to maybe mount it to canvas so that it can work really large scale, but still have that ability to kind of like wipe away the transparencies and the surface that I enjoy with the Yupo.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, Daniel, go ahead.
Oh, no, you go.
Okay, will do. Yeah, I also started painting oils. I started painting in oils at like a really young age. I got a set of like Bob Ross paints for my dad when I was 9, and I painted oils all the way through college. But I kind of fell in love with acrylic paint after college, one because it was like a cost-effective measure, but also just the amount of like just messing with this material that you can get with acrylic is like unbelievable, and you can really get a lot of the same effects that you get with oils with acrylic. Like, and I'm also really interested in drawing and then painting and then drawing on top and then painting on top and drawing on top. So I use a lot of wax pastel in my work. They're like they're like sort of semi-fancy crayons. So I'll use like the wax pastel and the aquarels, and the aquarels are water soluble. So I can create a drawn line and then like get some acrylic medium over it and blend it in like it's a watercolor, or it's like an acrylic paint that I'm adding pigment to. And that's added so much of a layering to my work, and like optical mixing, putting color on top of color. I've recently started painting on jute, which is a kind of fabric. It's canvas or linen that has this crazy, super thick weave. And it almost, my roommate Lauren, who's also a painter, described it really well as like, it's a material that demands some sacrifice. It's like, it's really difficult to get something right first try on something that will just pick up and eat a bunch of your paint. So it's like those paintings, and this isn't always true with my work, but it's kind of become more so. And one of the reasons I'm so excited to start this Liquitex residency is to experiment with thickness and to experiment to see how paintings can go through so many different iterations before they arrive at this final like level of finish. And I'm so interested in like expanding upon that.
Brilliant.
Yeah. Well, I also started with oil, but those paintings were very, very muddy. I wasn't a great oil painter. So what I used to paint out of my apartment was my home studio, and it was a little toxic. I went to bed a little dizzy a lot of nights. But I switched to acrylic, and I actually found I could do a lot of the same things. So I would thin out my acrylics and make sure they were all like transparent colors and transparent pigment loads, and glaze them the way you would, make a grisaille and glaze an oil painting to build up the layers and build up the colors and build up the transparency. But what really shifted my process was during the pandemic. I would say back in like late 2019, I was doing a whole bunch of just portraits, like a self-portrait, portraits of friends, and they weren't very good. Like, I went down some kind of rabbit hole. I was like, these works aren't very good, but I feel like I have to keep going and go to the end. And they just kind of stayed rolled up in the corner of my studio for like maybe the next 6 months. And, you know, kind of going through, being home, taking stock of everything. I'm like, there's good parts of these paintings, even if it's not good in the whole. So just experimenting with like Liquitex medium and collaging it, I decided to cut up those paintings and collage them into bigger compositions. And that really is what like broke my practice wide open. So essentially the last 2 years was me basically cutting up all my paintings, you know, or most of my paintings, or now sometimes I'll even collage in whole entire paintings. I got a whole lot of acrylic Liquitex from Christine Romanel, and just that let me open up and just use as much paint as I could rather than being a little more frugal. So now my process involves a lot of creating layers, cutting them up, collaging them on top of it, and I'll use the tube of paints to draw. Like, I always had a very strong drawing practice. I used a lot of calligraphy pens and that kind of calligraphic mark, and a lot of cross hatching. But I never could translate that into painting. Like, I always wanted to somehow bring that in, just trying to like draw with paint, just never quite had the effect. But I found the mark just from squeezing the tube directly onto the canvas, kind of gave me that same calligraphy mark. So it's a lot of building and layering. They don't translate well in photographs, but the paintings are very thick and textural. So it's definitely been an exploration of my ability to render against how can I kind of build up and make these things just like a textural monstrosity.
You can see a good example right behind you, Daniel.
Yeah.
Yeah. Let me see if I can like, yeah, you can like zoom in a little on the
Amazing.
The thickness of it all.
The thickness.
And
Are you
one
down with the
question
thickness?
for all of you, because you all have quite a vibrant use of color, which I find very joyful when I look at all of your works. And I'm wondering if joyful is something you'd associate with your use of color, or if there's anything else that you feel like you really kind of want to convey with those tones that you use.
I think for my work, content wise, it skews darker than expected, and the bright colorfulness and, you know, the draw of that is kind of my way. It's like the sweet to hide the medicine.
Yeah.
It's like the sugar coating on the pill.
That's a good, yeah. I think for me with color, I think the vibrancy is so important for me, because like I'm playing off of cartoon and internet culture in some form or another, and that like that digital color has to be present. I'm not 100% sure about the archivalness of it all, but I use a lot of fluorescence sometimes too. I went through this phase of work where I was making paintings and putting them under black light to see if they glowed in the dark, which had an influence in how I want color to like kind of sit next to each other, sit on top of them, to vibrate. And I also tend to go through like color obsessions that I don't notice until post-mortem, when I'm looking back on my Instagram feed, and it's like, oh, I went through an entire year where I was painting like these millennial pink paintings, and through most of 2021 I was making these paintings that were like toxic green. Like there was so much like green in that work, and I can see myself like trending to this direction where I'm painting with a lot of tertiaries of oranges and purples. So it's like these colors kind of like cycle through my head, and they end up just infecting everything for a certain period of time.
Yeah.
I kind of enjoy the association of symbolism that color has. Like purple was always what royalty wore during like the King Henry era and the Marie Antoinette. And I've also worked in fashion for the past decade. So I'm also super influenced by palettes and products a little bit. So I feel like between the draw from nature and then the fashion industry and then the context of like what the symbolism of the color means, I'm super interested. And in college, I did like a dissertation on white pigment because I was like, I need to understand the chemistry of this color and like understand how, you know, the difference between like lead white paint versus titanium white, and understand the opacity of it, because then I can inherently kind of learn those transparencies, the opacity, so that when I'm going to mix my palette, I've already set myself up to understand the chemistry of the paint and how it works, so that I don't have to just like, you know, think about it at this point. At this point, I kind of understand like acrylic and oil paint colors and how they mix together, so that if I'm going for a more opaque color, I know how to mix it and blend it and make it work for me. Or if I'm doing a glaze, I understand like that's going to really, really thin down that color and might make it look a little muddy depending on, you know, the color relationship of it. But I think that the funnest part about color is the things that I discover out in the world. And I'll just kind of like take a picture of like a piece of trash on the street of New York City, and it'll be like a crumbled up mask against the black asphalt or something like that. Those kinds of color relationships sometimes inspire me. And I have like some like random photos that I take that to someone looking at my phone, it'll just be like a lot of junk. But to me, it's kind of like, oh, I remember why I took that picture. I love the color relationship there. And then I'll kind of like look at it if I need ideas for, you know, colors in my paintings.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you all so much for talking today. It's been really great to hear from all of you, and there's so much synergy between your work as well. It's such a nice kind of relationship between what all of you are doing.
Yeah,
Thank
that's
you.
funny. That's it. Yeah, it's great how unexpected that can all become. Like when we put all of our work in a space, it's like kind of crazy how many associations we end up doing. It's like installing this show, Dogmatic Magic, was like so much of an experience of being like, oh wow, holy shit, I didn't know that one and this one looked so like they talk so much. So yeah, totally nail on the head. Our work like vibes so much, even though we're doing such disparate practices.
Yeah, excellent. Well, I hope the rest of the show goes well, and it was really lovely to catch up.
It was fantastic.
I'm so glad I got to be part of this. I'm so glad I found time.
Yeah.
Glad you could be on for the whole call. Thank you. See you later.
Thank you, Emily.
Thank you so much. This is wonderful. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Emily.
Bye.
Thanks.